Well, there's much to talk about. Joining us here in Washington is author, scholar, and columnist Yoshikazu Kato. Also with us is Troy Stangarone. He focuses on U.S. congressional affairs and trade for the Korea Economic Institute. Joining us from Beijing is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. And also with us here in Washington is Yonho Kim. He's with the U.S. Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Quite a panel we have. Yonho, let me start with you. First things first, was this a hydrogen bomb? What's your view?
What was the hydrogen bomb? Whether it is true, or we can take North Korea's claims at its face value. We still don't know, and I understand the seismic event was not that big enough to claim that it was a classic hydrogen bomb. And to determine the exact type of the bomb they tested, we still need to collect and analyze the air samples. And I understand that the U.S. is deploying their so-called nuclear sniffer plane near North Korea to collect the samples. But to be and that's why the U.S. was not successful in even collecting the particles when North Korea did their third nuclear test in 2013. And I'm sure North Korea made every effort to minimize the leaking of the particles.
Troy, why is the type of nuclear device that was detonated so important? I mean, you get some analysts saying that if it was a hydrogen bomb, this is a game changer. Why is that so important?
Well, there's a significant difference between a successful hydrogen test, which the early returns seem to indicate this wasn't, and a different type of test, either the prior plutonium and uranium tests. If you look at them in terms of scale, the tests they've had before were all on, and this one is estimated to be at about the 6, maybe 7 kiloton size. But if you look at a hydrogen bomb, which is a situation where you have two hydrogen atoms that are fused together rather than fission, it releases significantly more energy. So it tends to be on the scale of up to 100 or more kilotons. So you would be going from something that right now is below 10 kilotons to 10 times or more larger. So it would be significantly greater yield and destructive capacity. So it would be a significant change.
So if used, it would kill a lot more people and cause a lot more damage.
Yes, on a significantly higher scale.
Victor, China has expressed its concern over this nuclear explosion in the DPRK, calling it undesirable and unwise and running counter to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But what can China do right now?
Well, first of all, indeed, China has condemned the nuclear testing by DPRK this time and is urging on DPRK and other relevant parties to exercise self-restraint and avoid any further nuclear testing like this. And in this particular case, I think China itself is a victim of the nuclear testing because properties on the Chinese side of the border had suffered damages. A damage also happened to the infrastructure, including highways on the Chinese side of the border. It's important to emphasize that the testing site that DPRK used to test the nuclear device is only about 100 kilometers away from the Chinese border. So whatever nuclear device it may be, either hydrogen bomb or atomic bomb, etc., if it is a real nuclear device, then that might be long-term damage to the underground water sources or soil pollution and contamination, in addition to air contamination. And also the panic struck to the people, especially in the border region, is also a profound one. Many people had to flee from their homes or work offices, for example. And I think China no longer wants to tolerate such nuclear testing on the part of DPRK, in addition to whatever legal reasons that China already has plenty of to oppose such nuclear testing. I think going forward, China and the other relevant parties of the international community, as well as the United Nations Security Council, need to come up with consensus views as to how to deal with this kind of flagrant violations of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, and also adopt the same course of action. And I would say that so long as the international community can agree to do the same thing about the nuclear testing of DPRK, DPRK will no longer be able to get its way. I think DPRK's best case is to divide and rule, play China against the United States, or play US against China, and more recently playing China against Russia or vice versa. But if these major countries can really get onto the same page, I don't think DPRK can get too much mileage out of this kind of a gaming theory on their part. Eventually, the goal should remain firm. That is the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. This should be the only viable option for all the parties involved.
Right. Yoshi, what's been the reaction in Japan? This, of course, is in their neighborhood.
Yeah, yesterday, Abe's cabinet, got consensus in the cabinet. We were going to respond determinedly. So, probably we need to condemn and, coordinate with international society, including United States, South Korea. And at this moment, I think, it's very, really helpful, because we got an agreement with South Korea over the comfort women issue at the end of last year. So I think now the most important thing is, strengthen international cooperation and coordination and make sure what's really going to happen inside North Korea. Because, probably I figured out Japanese government respond because now we can't make sure what's really happening, H-bomb or not. So probably we need to continue to analyze, with not only, by Japan, but South Korea, United States, we need to strengthen this communication and respond determinedly and strengthen international cooperation. And probably we need to also check what's going to happen on Kim Jong-un's legitimacy, how accountable him inside North Korea. So probably still we need to wait and see what's going on. But for Japan we can't do anything independently. So particularly I am surprised because now at this moment North Korea even didn't inform China beforehand.
So what I'm hearing here from you and from Victor is that the key to resolving this crisis, to defusing it in some way, is through the six-party talks, which have been suspended.
Yeah, six-party talks, are suspended for a long time. But, I somehow agree, Chinese government emphasized probably six-party talk will be only practical and realistic way, to resume this, international cooperation. But, it's still, we have to look, somehow because, actually, six-party talk, it has been important for resolving this issue, but now it has been suspended for a long time. So, how much China could exercise its leadership or as a platform, for resolution, how would be, practical is needed. Yeah.
Right. China has called for those talks to be rebooted, as it put it. Yonho, this is just the latest test that has been carried out by the DPRK. What do we know about its nuclear arsenal and how big it is?
This $100 million question, but the common sense among the scientists are that probably around 10 nuclear devices they have been able to produce, but depending on what kind of assumption you have, by 2020 they could have more than 200 or less than 100. This one big open question. And another, important question is, whether they are able to mount a nuclear warhead on the missile, and it is believed that at least they are able to do that for their short and medium-range missiles, but not intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBM). That has been conventional wisdom, but recently, U.S. military officials, for example, U.S. commander said at a news conference April of last year that the Pentagon's assessment is that North Korea has the ability to mount a nuclear warhead, even on a mobile ICBM, KN-08.
That delivery system that you're talking about, how far would it go?
Medium range, intercontinental ballistic missiles, by definition, it is supposed to reach the continental U.S., at least the west coast of the continental U.S. But when it comes to their medium range missile, Nodong missile, it can reach Japan and Guam, where U.S. military bases are located.
Troy, this came as a surprise to many people in the world when this test was carried out. Some analysts are saying, look, what has happened here is that the DPRK's nuclear program was actually put on the back burner as far as the international community was concerned, while they were preoccupied with things like the Iran nuclear deal, with violence in the Middle East, the Syria crisis, and of course Ukraine as well. Is this what happened here?
I don't think so. If we look back, there were two different things going on. One, when President Obama came into office, North Korea was a priority. Many people actually thought North Korea would be the place where he would go and negotiate a deal. It seemed like the most obvious target. What we found over time is that North Korea has been unwilling to engage in talks. If we go back to when Ambassador Bosworth was our special representative, to Glenn Davies, who took over and negotiated what's known as the Leap Day Agreement right after Kim Jong-un came into power. We shortly had a violation of that agreement afterwards where North Korea tested a missile to put a satellite into space. And then if you proceed even now to Sun Kim's era, last year Sun Kim was willing to go meet with the North Koreans, try to find a way to talk and restart negotiations. But we had the MERS situation in South Korea. The North Koreans' response to Sun Kim at the time was, well, if you're willing to come to North Korea, stay in quarantine for an extended period of time, and then have talks with us, we're willing to do that. So they were unwilling to go to Beijing to meet with him. They wanted to take in place these unrealistic expectations on talks. So we've had this difficulty of trying to even get them into talks to begin with.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
A global poll calls Panama the happiest place on the planet. But with high rates of poverty, inequality, and corruption, is this happy country covering up a sad state of affairs?
We have an unacceptable polarization. For a rich country, it is unacceptable to have a quarter of your population in poverty.
Correspondent Jerry Haddon travels to booming Panama City to define the true meaning of happiness. This week on America's Now.
We strongly urge the DPRK side to remain committed to its denuclearization commitment and stop taking actions that would make the situation worse.
Welcome back. That was Hua Chunying with the Chinese Foreign Ministry reacting to the DPRK's claim of a successful hydrogen bomb test earlier this week. Let's get back to our panel right now. Victor, China is often seen as the world power with the most influence over what happens in the DPRK. But in reality, how much leverage can Beijing bring to bear on the government in Pyongyang?
Well, first of all, China does have very good relations with DPRK, stretching out for decades. And on the Chinese side, I think the government and the people here in this country have goodwill towards the people in DPRK as well as the government in DPRK. However, on the other hand, I think partially because China has such good relations with DPRK, China is firmly opposed to DPRK experimenting with nuclear devices because China firmly believes that by doing so, DPRK is not doing itself a service, and it is actually destabilizing the situation on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. On the other hand, I would say China does not have unlimited influence over DPRK. On many occasions, DPRK seems to disregard the good advices and the very serious warnings that Chinese government has given to DPRK. And as I mentioned, DPRK sometimes also plays China against the US or vice versa. And I think China has been patient with DPRK, and all these years, China has been advocating doing the diplomacy and dialogue through the six-party talk framework. Even though the six-party talk framework is not a perfect one, and up to today, it has not yet yielded the desired result, I would say, pragmatically speaking, the six-party talk framework remains the only viable option for a peaceful solution to the denuclearization issue on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I would say China will continue to promote the six-party talk and try its best to bring DPRK back to the negotiation table and engaging in multilateral negotiations with DPRK so that eventually it will realize that it is doing its government as well as the North Korean people a big disservice by continuously experimenting with these nuclear devices. North Korea cannot feed its people with nuclear weapons, and I would say the international community will refuse to be bluffed by the nuclear bombing and experiments by the DPRK government once and twice and three times, and now it's the fourth time.
Right, Yoshi, and of course the international community is looking at these developments in the DPRK with a lot of alarm, especially the countries around the DPRK. What do you think is the next step? Where does it go to from here?
Yeah, I think, of course, to resume six-party talk, that would be a good way, but, I do not think it's a realistic way. So probably now I'm looking at, probably UN Security Council.
But if that's not realistic, is there a danger here that other countries in the region might join this arms race?
But the problem is, Shinzo Abe, Japanese Prime Minister, emphasized, we should have comprehensive resolution because, for Japan, not only missile and nuclear issue, but we also have abduction issue. So actually, we would have different commitments to these issues, and of course, in China, United States, and South Korea, probably we would have different position, different interest on this peninsula and on this issue. That's why it's very hard to resume six-party talks. In order to put together our intentions and national interests, that would be really difficult. So I'm looking at probably UN, the United Nations, probably Security Council would be only, at this moment, practical way to strengthen our communication and then check and balance this situation. So, I am not optimistic for resuming six-party talks.
I just want to take a step back here on the DPRK's nuclear program. It's not a rich country. It's not a country with a great deal of scientific know-how. How did it get this knowledge in the first place? Did it just go out and buy it, or what happened?
Well, I understand their nuclear program has very long history, starting around in the 1950s or 60s. They got their technology or experimental technology, or even their 5-kilowatt nuclear reactor from the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War was collapsed, they didn't have their financial big brother from Soviet Union anymore. So and they had to go through economic problem, very serious problem in the 1990s. But even so, North Korea, the leadership put this is a priority on this nuclear program, and just kept funding the program, and also had some technological assistance from Pakistan, for example. So there are a lot of clandestine transactions between North Korea and other states also.
Troy, we're seeing a number of measures being considered against the DPRK. One of them here in the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, has passed legislation which will target the DPRK's ability to enter financial markets, as well as banks that deal with the DPRK. Will that work?
At this point, I think it's questionable. What we're seeing right now is that, as you mentioned, North Korea is not a rich country. It's not that interconnected internationally. We do know that they have money in banks abroad. We do know they move it around for their illegal operations. Clamping down on these things is one way to take and send a signal, but it's going to be difficult. When we look back at the Banco Delta Asia situation, they had taken, and after they received the money back, they learned from that experience, and they took and started spreading their money out into smaller amounts in different banks and using different methods. So I think, this is an important step forward, but ultimately this is a cat and mouse game with North Korea. We will take measures to go after them financially and their trade measures, but they're also going to learn from that and find ways to evade those measures. So I think, this is a step forward. It makes sense. I think this is what we're going to do. Perhaps the interesting aspect here is that, North Korea is the one thing that can really actually bring Democrats and Republicans together in Washington, D.C., but I think, there's still going to be challenges with North Korea despite these sanctions, if they're passed Congress and if the president signs it and moves forward with it.
Victor, how far can the world go with sanctions against the DPRK? Because there must be concerns, and we've heard these concerns being expressed, that too much pressure being brought on the DPRK could lead to destabilization there, which could be even worse than what the situation is right now.
Well, I would say, in my personal judgment, the worst-case scenario for DPRK is its continued experiment with the nuclear weapon program, and eventually it may actually indulge in the fantasy that it can actually bluff other countries in its facility, or even get its way around in the international community. I think we need to unite to avoid that scenario from happening, and we cannot afford to allow this kind of scenario happen on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I would say, now that it's the fourth experiment with the nuclear device by DPRK, major countries, and I would say including China, Russia, and the United States, need to really get onto the same page about what they need to do together, rather than being allowed to be divided and ruled by DPRK, being played one against the other or vice versa by DPRK. Because if China, the United States, and Russia cannot get onto the same page about the nuclear program of DPRK, DPRK eventually will prevail and get its way with a more enhanced and strengthened nuclear weapon system. And that will be the worst case scenario. It will highly destabilize the peace and stability, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but beyond. Therefore, I think it is time for China, US, and Russia in particular, together with other countries, of course, to come up with the same course of action. And I think in this context, it's encouraging that the US Secretary of State John Kerry and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi have already engaged in personal talk with each other, and they agree to further discuss what China and the United States need to do together on the same wavelength, for example, in dealing with this particular issue, rather than one doing one course of action and the other country doing very different course of action.
So Yoshi, here we have a situation where the international community is considering new measures against DPRK, but how important is it that they calibrate those new measures very, very carefully to hurt the leadership in the DPRK on the one hand, but not destabilize the country?
Yeah, it's very difficult to take balance between keep stabilization in this peninsula, but at the same time to push North Korea stop this provocation. So it's very difficult. But following Victor Gao's comment, I think. Of course, we shouldn't overestimate Chinese influence to North Korea, but probably China would be the key because for in DPRK survive, Chinese continuous aid, economic aid would be probably over the years really inevitable. So I'm concerned about how much China could be patient, to this situation because this time, as I mentioned, even DPRK didn't inform China in advance. At this moment,
right.
That's why I don't know how much China could be patient to this situation, and this will be the key for China to make a decision how to make a commitment to international sanction to DPRK because probably China has had different concern over the sanction issues unlike Japan, United States. So I think China will be the key in this context.
Yonho, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, is in the front line. It's, of course, part of the Korean Peninsula. I want you to take a listen to what one of the national security advisors in South Korea in the presidential office had to say. Let's watch this.
We will take all possible measures, including further United Nations sanctions, by closely cooperating with the international community, including our allies and countries of the six-party talks, so that DPRK will pay the price for the nuclear test.
So here we have the Republic of Korea saying, yes, we will support new sanctions, but at the same time, South Korea has also said that it wants the United States to deploy more strategic weapons on its territory. What is the mood like in South Korea now? Are people scared?
It's been decades for South Korean people to face this very hostile brothers in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. So I believe people are not panicking at all. This is just another nuclear test by North Korea. But what they may be concerned about is possible escalation of tension between the two Koreas along the demilitarized zone, because South Korean government restarted their propaganda broadcasting in the area, pointing out that North Korea basically violated the agreement that was made in April of last year. So, I mean, when there was a propaganda campaign, done by the South Korean side in retaliation for North Korea's landmine attack at the time, North Korea described it as an act of war and threatened to strike the related facilities. So once South Korea restarted the program, then North Korea may think again about very hostile reaction. That might be a big concern for the South Korean people now.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to our great panel for your contribution here today.